In 1954, the government of the United States overthrew a democratically elected president in Latin America. Not because he was a dictator, not because he was a communist agent working for Moscow, and not because he threatened American security in any conventional sense. He was overthrown in large part because he tried to give unused farmland to poor farmers, and that land happened to belong to an American fruit company.
This isn't a fringe theory. It isn't buried in some obscure academic journal nobody reads. The CIA itself has publicly acknowledged the operation, declassified its own internal planning documents, and given it a code name, PB Success. And yet, walk into almost any American high school and ask a student about it, and you'll get silence. Ask them about Guatemala at all, and most won't be able to point to it on a map. This is the story of how that silence was built, and what it cost, not just in the moment, but across the following 4 decades.
To understand why this coup happened, you first have to understand what Guatemala already was, well before 1954. For much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Guatemala functioned as something close to a textbook example of what came to be called, somewhat dismissively, a banana republic, a country whose government, infrastructure, and export economy were shaped less by its own citizens than by the needs of foreign agricultural corporations. This wasn't unique to Guatemala. The term itself was coined by the writer O. Henry to describe the broader pattern across Central America. But Guatemala became one of the clearest cases of it in practice.
Dictators like Manuel Estrada Cabrera and later Jorge Ubico granted enormous land concessions, tax exemptions, and infrastructure control to foreign companies, chief among them, eventually, the United Fruit Company, in exchange for political support and economic investment that rarely trickled down to the rural population actually working the land. Jorge Ubico, who ruled from 1931 to 1944, represented the culmination of this pattern. He governed with the kind of absolute control that made political opposition essentially illegal. Critics were jailed, exiled, or worse, and Ubico famously modeled his own self-image on Napoleon, filling the presidential palace with Napoleonic portraits and memorabilia.
Under his rule, a system called vagrancy laws legally required indigenous Guatemalans without sufficient landholdings to work a set number of days per year on plantations owned by others, a practice that functioned, in effect, as a modern continuation of forced labor systems dating back to the colonial period. It was against this backdrop of dictatorship, foreign corporate dominance, and a rural population with essentially no path toward economic independence that everything else in this story has to be understood.
In 1944, a coalition of students, teachers, and reform-minded military officers overthrew Ubico in what became known as the October Revolution. Among the officers involved was a young career soldier named Jacobo Árbenz Guzman, not a firebrand ideologue, but a disciplined military professional who came from a middle-class family and had married into Guatemalan high society. Ubico's fall opened what historians now call the 10 Years of Spring, a decade of democratic experimentation almost unheard of in Central America at the time.
The first freely elected president of this new era was Juan José Arevalo, a philosophy professor who had spent years in exile in Argentina before returning to run for office. Arevalo's government introduced Guatemala's first labor code, established a minimum wage, created a national social security system, and dramatically expanded public education and literacy programs, particularly in rural areas that had previously been almost entirely neglected by the state. None of this was radical by the standards of contemporary Western Europe,
or even the American New Deal a decade earlier. But in the context of Central America in the 1940s, it represented a genuinely unprecedented shift in how a government treated its own poorest citizens. When Árbenz won the presidency in 1951, in an election generally regarded by international observers as free and competitive, he inherited both Arévalo's reformist momentum and Guatemala's oldest, most explosive unresolved problem: land. Here's the number that explains almost everything that follows. In the early 1950s, roughly 2% of Guatemala's landowners controlled around 70% of the country's arable land.
Most of that land wasn't even being farmed. It sat idle, held for speculation, or simply as a symbol of wealth and inherited status, while the majority of the rural population, many of them Indigenous Maya, descendants of communities whose own ancestral lands had been steadily reduced over centuries of colonization and subsequent land concessions, worked tiny plots or labored for near nothing on someone else's plantation. This kind of land inequality wasn't uniquely Guatemalan. It existed, in varying degrees, across much of Latin America. But in Guatemala, it collided directly with the interests of one of the most powerful corporations in the entire Western Hemisphere. That corporation was the United Fruit Company, known informally throughout Central America as El Pulpo, the octopus, for the way its economic and political reach seemed to extend into every corner of national life. United Fruit had been operating in Guatemala since the early 1900s, having secured its initial concessions under earlier dictatorial governments in exchange for building the country's first modern railroad.
By the early 1950s, the company was the country's largest single landowner by a wide margin. It controlled Guatemala's primary railroad almost entirely through a subsidiary. It owned and operated the country's main Atlantic port at Puerto Barrios, and it held a controlling interest in the national telegraph and telephone networks through another subsidiary. Guatemala did not simply have a large fruit exporter operating within its borders. In a very real sense, the country's entire export economy ran on infrastructure that one foreign company owned outright and could, in principle, use as leverage. Crucially, the vast majority of United Fruit's Guatemalan landholdings sat completely uncultivated at any given time, held in reserve against the risk of disease outbreaks among the banana crop, a real and recurring problem in the industry, or for future expansion that might never actually happen. In June of 1952, Árbenz signed into law Decree 900, Guatemala's Agrarian Reform Act, modeled loosely on land reform programs that had already been implemented, with considerably less controversy, in countries like Mexico decades earlier. The law targeted only uncultivated land on large estates above a certain size threshold, and it explicitly protected small farms and any land that was actively being cultivated, regardless of the size of the estate it belonged to. Landowners whose idle acreage was expropriated were to be compensated in 25-year government bonds, though, controversially, that compensation was calculated based on the property values landowners themselves had declared for tax purposes in previous years. This detail matters enormously to how the rest of the story unfolds, because for years, United Fruit had deliberately undervalued its own land on its tax filings, specifically to minimize its Guatemalan tax burden. Now, that same self-reported, artificially low valuation became the legal basis for what the Guatemalan government would pay to expropriate it. United Fruit was livid. The company demanded compensation of roughly $16 million for its expropriated land, a figure wildly higher than the tax-declared value the Guatemalan government offered, which came to under $600,000. The gap between those two numbers is, in many ways, the gap at the heart of this entire story. A company that had spent years minimizing its land's value specifically to avoid taxes, suddenly insisting that same land was worth roughly 30 times more the moment it was being taken away from it.
Under Decree 900, roughly 500,000 families, a substantial portion of Guatemala's rural population at the time, eventually received land, either through direct redistribution of expropriated estates or through newly available government credit to purchase and work smaller parcels. For many indigenous Guatemalan communities, some of whom had lived for generations as effectively landless laborers tied to plantations they didn't own, this represented the first real material change in their economic position in living memory. And by most contemporary economic assessments, it began meaningfully increasing agricultural productivity and rural income in the regions where it was implemented. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something historians still actively debate, because the golden hero versus corporate villain framing, while emotionally satisfying, oversimplifies a genuinely contested history. How much of Árbenz's broader agenda was driven by pragmatic social and economic reform versus a real ideological alignment with the political left is disputed.
Árbenz was not, by his own repeated public statements or by the assessment of most contemporary historians, a committed Marxist. But he did legalize Guatemala's Communist Party, the Partido Guatemalteco del Trabajo, and worked closely with several of its members within his administration, including in positions with real influence over land reform policy. This gave Washington a genuine, if ultimately disproportionate, pretext to view his government with suspicion, independent of any direct pressure applied by United Fruit's lobbying operation.
This is not a story with a single clean villain and a single clean motive. It's a story where corporate interest and Cold War ideological anxiety reinforced each other so thoroughly that in practice, separating the two becomes difficult even for historians working with full access to the declassified record decades later. What is much harder to dispute is the extraordinarily dense web of personal connections linking United Fruit directly to the highest levels of the U.S. government at the exact moment this crisis was unfolding. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had, before entering government, worked for years as a lawyer at the New York firm Sullivan & Cromwell, which represented United Fruit's legal interests and had personally helped negotiate several of the company's earlier land concession agreements in Guatemala.
His younger brother, Alan Dulles, who ran the CIA throughout this period, had also done legal work connected to the company and had previously sat on its board of trustees. Assistant Secretary of State John Moores Cabot's own family held significant personal stock in United Fruit. Ed Whitman, the company's principal public relations liaison and lobbyist in Washington, was married to President Eisenhower's own personal secretary, Ann Whitman, who worked in the Oval Office itself.
None of this alone proves that Guatemala's land reform was overturned purely as a favor to a single company. Intelligence assessments of the era genuinely did treat Guatemala's legalized Communist Party as a Cold War concern in its own right. But it paints an unmistakable picture of how tightly interwoven corporate and governmental interests had become by 1954, to the point where distinguishing American strategic interest from United Fruit's balance sheet becomes, at points, genuinely difficult, even in hindsight.
United Fruit ran an aggressive and sophisticated public relations campaign inside the United States to shape the political and media narrative around Guatemala, hiring the firm run by Edward Bernays, often called, with good reason, the father of modern public relations. Journalists were flown to Guatemala on company-sponsored trips, given carefully curated tours and briefings. Reports characterizing Árbenz's government as an emerging Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere subsequently appeared in major American newspapers, even though direct Guatemalan ties to the Soviet Union were, by the CIA's own later internal admissions, extremely thin at best.
Guatemala maintained no formal diplomatic relationship with the USSR at all during this period, and Soviet interest in, or support for the Árbenz's government was, by most later intelligence reassessments, negligible. What Guatemala did have was a legalized communist party with limited but genuinely growing influence, a land reform law that directly threatened the largest single American investment in the country, and a president who refused repeatedly and publicly to reverse course despite mounting diplomatic and economic pressure from Washington.
By 1953, the Eisenhower administration had formally approved a covert operation run through the CIA with the explicit and stated goal of removing Árbenz's from power. The plan was codenamed PB Success, and it represented one of the CIA's earliest full-scale attempts at engineering regime change through covert psychological and political action, rather than direct military invasion. A template that would be studied, refined, and reused with significant variations elsewhere in Latin America and beyond for decades afterward, including later, more infamous operations. The operation was, on a purely technical military level, almost absurdly modest compared to the outcome it ultimately produced. The CIA recruited, trained, and armed a small exile force, numbering only a few hundred men, led by a Guatemalan military officer named Carlos Castillo Armas, who had been living in exile in neighboring Honduras since a failed uprising attempt years earlier. This force was never seriously intended to defeat the much larger Guatemalan National Army in direct combat, and by most later military assessments, it almost certainly couldn't have. Instead, the CIA's strategy relied heavily on psychological warfare and the deliberate manufacturing of confusion. A clandestine radio station, broadcasting from just outside Guatemala's borders, but presented to domestic listeners as an authentic internal rebel voice, reported wildly exaggerated advances by Castillo Armas's forces day after day, spreading panic and the impression of an overwhelming, unstoppable invasion already well underway. A small number of CIA aircraft, flown by American contract pilots, conducted limited bombing runs over Guatemala City, intended less to cause massive physical damage than to shatter civilian and military morale and project the appearance of total, imminent military collapse. The psychological pressure worked. On June 27, 1954, facing what he believed, based on the fragmented, deliberately distorted information reaching him through captured radio broadcasts and second-hand reports, to be a much larger and more capable invading force than actually existed on the ground, and increasingly abandoned by segments of his own military leadership, who either quietly sympathized with the plotters or simply refused to commit their troops to fight, Árbenz resigned. He gave a farewell radio address to the Guatemalan people, explicitly and directly naming United Fruit and the government of the United States as responsible for his removal, a claim that, for decades afterward, was dismissed in mainstream American commentary as little more than communist propaganda, until the CIA's own declassified internal histories, released piecemeal starting in the 1990s and more fully in the following decade, confirmed the operation's existence, its funding, and its objectives in exhaustive detail. Árbenz went into exile. He would spend the following decades moving between countries: Mexico, Switzerland, France, Uruguay, largely unable to return to Guatemala,
watching from a distance as the country he had governed underwent a transformation he could do nothing to stop or influence. He died in 1971 in Mexico City, in circumstances that remain disputed to this day, officially recorded as an accidental drowning in a bathtub, though the specific details surrounding his death have never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of all historians who have examined the case.
Carlos Castillo Armas took power in Guatemala with direct American backing and swiftly moved to dismantle nearly everything the preceding decade had built. Decree 900 was almost immediately reversed. Land that had been redistributed to hundreds of thousands of families was returned to its previous large-scale owners, including United Fruit, which received back the vast majority of what it had lost. The legalized political left was banned outright, its members and sympathizers subjected to arrest, and a period of intense political repression began, targeting labor organizers, teachers, students, and anyone publicly associated with the reforms of the preceding decade, an early preview of the far larger repression to come. Castillo Armas himself was assassinated in 1957 by a member of his own presidential guard under circumstances that remain murky and contested, opening a period of prolonged political instability that within a few years hardened into open civil war.
This is the part of the story that gets told least often in the United States, and it is also, by an overwhelming margin, the part with the highest human cost. The Guatemalan Civil War that followed the 1954 coup lasted 36 years, until 1996. It is, by most historical measures, the longest sustained civil conflict in modern Latin American history.
Successive military governments, several of them backed at various points with U.S. training, funding, and intelligence support throughout the Cold War, fought against leftist guerrilla movements that had emerged in significant part from the wreckage of the crushed reform movement Árbenz had once led, along with later generations of fighters born well after 1954, who had never known anything but military rule. The war's most devastating phase came in the early 1980s, under the military government of General Efraín Ríos Montt, who seized power in a coup in 1982. During his roughly 17 months in power, the Guatemalan military carried out a scorched earth counterinsurgency campaign, primarily targeting indigenous Maya communities across the country's western highlands, on the premise, frequently unsupported by actual evidence in specific documented cases, that these communities were harboring or actively sympathizing with guerrilla fighters.
Entire villages were destroyed. Guatemala's own United Nations-backed Commission for Historical Clarification, which conducted an extensive multi-year post-war investigation drawing on thousands of witness testimonies, concluded that state security forces were responsible for the overwhelming majority, by its estimate, over 90% of the roughly 200,000 deaths and disappearances documented over the full course of the war, and that acts committed against specific Maya communities during this period met the legal definition of genocide.
It would be a significant oversimplification to draw a straight, uninterrupted causal line directly from the 1954 coup to every individual atrocity committed during the genocide of the 1980s. Nearly 3 decades, several changes of government, and an increasingly independent internal Guatemalan political and military dynamic separate the two events, and responsible historians are careful not to collapse that real complexity into a single, tidy chain of cause and effect.
But the through line is nonetheless real, well documented, and widely accepted among historians of the period. The 1954 coup dismantled Guatemala's fragile, still young democratic institutions at a formative moment, installed a series of military governments with weak civilian oversight and little public accountability, and set in motion the broader political conditions: deep land inequality left fundamentally unresolved, a banned and radicalized political left driven underground and eventually toward armed insurgency, a military apparatus trained and equipped in significant part with U.S. funding, support, and operating with minimal internal accountability. That made the following decades of conflict and eventually genocide dramatically more likely than they would otherwise have been.
In 1999, President Bill Clinton, during an official visit to Guatemala, shortly after the Commission for Historical Clarification released its final report, offered a formal apology on behalf of the United States for the American government's support of Guatemalan security forces during the Civil War, explicitly stating that such support had been wrong.
It was a significant, if largely symbolic, acknowledgement. One of the few times a sitting American president has directly and publicly apologized for a specific Cold War-era intervention of this kind in Latin America. It did not undo 36 years of war, and it came 16 years after the worst of the genocide had already taken place, and roughly 45 years after the operation that helped set the entire chain of events in motion. So here is the shape of this story, laid out end to end. A democratically elected government tried to redistribute unused farmland to hundreds of thousands of landless families, following through on reforms that had begun a decade earlier with the fall of a long dictatorship. That reform directly threatened the largest American corporate landholding in the country, a company with extraordinarily close, extensively documented personal ties to the very officials in Washington who would ultimately decide the country's fate. Cold War fears about communism, some genuine and some deliberately manufactured and amplified through a sophisticated corporate public relations campaign, provided the political cover for a covert operation that removed an elected president through psychological warfare rather than open invasion. What followed was not stability, but 36 years of civil war, and at its darkest and most devastating point, a genocide against Indigenous Maya communities. A chapter of 20th century history that unfolded almost entirely outside the American public's awareness, even as American funding, training, and intelligence support touched multiple critical phases of the conflict that made it possible. Guatemala is not an isolated incident, and understanding it in isolation misses the larger pattern it belongs to. The template built in 1954, covert operation, engineered psychological pressure, and installed replacement government, minimal direct American fingerprints left on the historical record, would echo with significant variations elsewhere across Latin America and beyond throughout the remainder of the Cold War. Understanding what happened here is not just about correcting one historical record. It's about recognizing a pattern that shaped an entire region's 20th century, largely out of view of the country that set it in motion, and whose consequences, in Guatemala's case, are still being litigated in courtrooms and reckoned with by survivors today. So maybe the real question isn't whether this was about communism or about a banana company, because, as the evidence overwhelmingly shows, it was genuinely about both, tangled together in ways that are difficult to fully separate, even now, with the benefit of decades of declassified records. Maybe the real question is this: how many other chapters of American Cold War history are sitting in declassified documents, publicly available, fully acknowledged by the very agencies that carried them out, and still, somehow, missing
from the textbooks that are supposed to teach us where the modern world actually came from.